She saw everyone avoid the Mafia boss's deaf daughter until she spoke with her in sign language. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The chandeliers dripped light, casting a crystalline glow over the assembled predators of New York City. Men in bespoke suits prowled the edges of conversations, their smiles sharp and their eyes assessing, while women adorned in jewels moved like elegant, dangerous birds of paradise. Vivian Thorne, balancing a tray of champagne flutes, felt like a field mouse that had stumbled into a den of beautifully groomed lions. Every nerve ending screamed at her to flee, to blend into the shadows, but the weight of her desperation was a heavier burden than the silver tray. The cash from this catering gig was her ticket out, another bus ride to another city where Mark Jensen might not find her. The thought of his name was a shard of ice in her gut. She forced it down, focusing on the task, on the sheer, overwhelming opulence of the Capatos Holdings Grand Philanthropy Gala. Man at the center of this glittering universe was its namesake, Nico Capatos. He stood near the grand staircase, a figure carved from marble and shadow, exuding an aura of such absolute power that the air around him seemed to thin and crackle. Men approached him with deference, their bravado shrinking in his presence. He was not just a chief executive officer. The whispers that followed him down every corridor and across every society page painted him as something far older and more formidable. A king, a tyrant, the head of the Greek Mafia. Vivian's focus was not on him, however. It was on the small figure standing in the alcove beside the marble pillars, half hidden by a ridiculously large fern. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, in a velvet dress the color of a summer sky. She clutched a small, worn-looking stuffed rabbit, her dark curls framing a face of perfect, heartbreaking solitude. This was Daisy Capatos, the boss's daughter. Vivian had heard the staff gossiping. The child was deaf, her mother having died in childbirth. Guests would glance her way, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear, whispering to one another before turning away. No one approached her. It was as if a force field, generated by her father's fearsome reputation, surrounded her, leaving her utterly alone in a room of hundreds. Vivian's heart ached with a familiarity that was sharp and painful. She knew that kind of isolation, the feeling of being behind invisible glass, watching the world move on without you. Her own cousin, Michael, had been born deaf, and she had spent her childhood learning to cross that silent barrier, her hands becoming a second voice. She watched as Daisy's shoulders slumped, her gaze fixed on the polished floor. It was more than Vivian could bear. On her designated break, her feet throbbing in the cheap but sensible black flats she wore, Vivian found herself drifting not toward the staff room but toward the alcove. She saw the little girl's rabbit slip from her grasp and fall to the floor with a soft, unnoticed thud. Taking a deep breath, Vivian moved forward. She knelt, her knees protesting, and picked up the toy. The girl looked up, her eyes, the same startling stormy gray as her father's, wide with surprise. Vivian offered a small, gentle smile. Instead of speaking, she let her hands do the talking. She tapped her chin with her index finger, then moved her hand away in a soft arc. "Thank you," she had said, signing the rabbit's part. Then she looked into the girl's eyes and formed the sign slowly, clearly. "My name is Vivian. What's yours?" Daisy's jaw went slack. Her eyes darted from Vivian's face to her hands and back again, a spark of disbelief flickering within them. Then a slow, wondrous light began to dawn in her expression. Her own small hands, hesitant at first, moved. Daisy. The name was formed with a simple, delicate motion. Vivian's smile widened. "It's a beautiful name," she signed, "like the flower. Your rabbit is very cute. What's his name?" Daisy's face broke into a full, radiant smile that transformed her from a sad porcelain doll into a vibrant, living child. It was the first real smile Vivian had seen all night. "Barnaby," she signed, her movements becoming more confident. They fell into a silent, secret conversation, their hands weaving stories in the air about rabbits and dresses and the silly hats some of the ladies were wearing. For a few precious minutes, there was no gala, no danger, only the simple, pure joy of connection. Across the ballroom, Nico Capatos felt it before he saw it. A shift in the atmosphere, a subtle crack in the icy control he maintained over himself and his world. His gaze, which had been sweeping the room in a calculated assessment of threats and opportunities, snagged on the alcove. He saw his daughter, his Daisy, his solitary, silent heart, and she was smiling. Not the faint, polite ghost of a smile she sometimes gave him, but a real, joy-aching, soul-lifting smile. And kneeling before her was a woman, a server, judging by her simple black dress. Her back was to him, but he could see her hands moving with a fluid grace, a language he did not understand but whose effect was devastatingly clear. He watched, frozen, as his daughter's own hands danced in response, her entire being illuminated with a light he had thought long extinguished. The world narrowed to that single, impossible scene. The noise of the gala, the obsequious politicians, the scheming business rivals, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. For the first time since his wife Alina's death, the wall of ice around his heart fissured. He felt a violent, possessive jolt, a feeling so intense it was almost painful. Who was this woman? How had she breached the walls of his daughter's silence when the most expensive specialists and therapists had failed? He began to move, his steps measured and silent, a predator closing in on something that had startled and intrigued him in equal measure. Vivian felt the chill before she saw the shadow. The air grew heavy, the ambient chatter nearby dying abruptly. She looked up from signing a joke about Barnaby's twitching nose and saw him. Nico Capato stood over them, a titan in a tuxedo. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable handsomeness, but his eyes were like chips of granite, hard and assessing. They weren't looking at his daughter. They were fixed on Vivian, and their intensity was a physical force that made the air in her lungs feel thin. "Who are you?" His voice was a low, quiet rumble, more threatening than any shout. It held the gravelly undertone of smoke-filled rooms and commands that were never disobeyed. Vivian's blood ran cold. The lie was on her lips before she even thought it through, a desperate, instinctual act of self-preservation. Getting fired was one thing, but drawing the attention of a man like this, a man whose name was synonymous with danger. Mark would never find her if she was a nameless, faceless server. But if Nico Capato's took an interest, her name, her real name, could end up on a list on a background check on Mark's desk. I'm a guest," she stammered, rising slowly to her feet, her mind racing. "Dr. Vivian Thorne, I'm a child development specialist. My focus is on alternative communication." The lie was flimsy, a house of cards built on panic, but it was all she had. "I saw your daughter was feeling overwhelmed. I just wanted to help." Nico's gaze didn't waver. He looked from her face to her hands, and then down to Daisy, who had shrunk back, her smile gone, her hand now clutching his trouser leg. "You know sign language," he stated, not a question. Vivian nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, I'm fluent." He was silent for a long, terrifying moment, his mind clearly working behind those impenetrable eyes. He saw not a server in a cheap dress, but a doctor, a specialist. An answer to a prayer he had long given up on. "I have been searching for a tutor for my daughter," he said, his tone shifting from suspicion to command. "Someone who can not only teach her but connect with her. The position is live-in. The salary is negotiable. You will start tomorrow." It wasn't an offer, it was a decree. Vivian's world tilted on its axis. It was insane. It was a gilded cage, but it was also a fortress. Mark, with his detective's badge and his relentless cruelty, could never touch her here. Buried in the heart of the Capato's empire, she would be safer than she had been in years. And the money, it was a way out, a permanent one. The lie had trapped her, but it had also, paradoxically, offered her a sanctuary. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word a faint whisper. "Yes, I accept." Vivian's first day at the Capato's estate felt less like starting a new job and more like being inducted into a silent, opulent cult. A black car with windows as dark as secrets had collected her from her shabby apartment before dawn. She had packed her few belongings into a single suitcase, the lie she had told Nico Capato's a heavy stone in her stomach. She was no doctor, no specialist. She was just Vivian, a woman who had once dreamed of being a teacher before her life was derailed by a man's obsession. Now, she was walking into the heart of another man's dangerous world, armed with nothing but a second language and a desperate hope for invisibility. The estate was a sprawling stone behemoth overlooking the Hudson, a modern-day castle complete with gates, high walls, and guards whose tailored suits did little to hide the grim professionalism in their eyes. Inside, the silence was the most intimidating feature. It was a heavy, weighted silence, absorbed by thick Persian rugs, dark wood paneling, and ceilings so high they seemed to be holding up the sky itself. A stern-faced housekeeper named Mrs. Petrovic showed Vivian to her room. A suite, really, that was larger than her entire apartment. It was decorated in muted tones of cream and gray, beautiful and impersonal, a luxurious prison cell. Her lie had bought her this, but every moment felt like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the formidable Mr. Capatos to see through her flimsy credentials and cast her out. Her one solace was Daisy. The little girl, when she was brought to the private classroom that had been prepared for them, was shy at first. The radiant joy from the gala had been replaced by a familiar, guarded watchfulness. Vivian understood. This was a world where smiles were currency and trust was a commodity too precious to be given freely. So she didn't push. She simply sat with Daisy, and she began to sign. She didn't sign about lessons or expectations. She signed about Barnaby the rabbit, giving him a heroic backstory as a knight who defended the kingdom of Daisy's bedroom from dust bunnies. She told stories with her hands, her expressions, her entire body, creating a world just for them. Slowly, painstakingly, the walls Daisy had built around herself began to crumble. A small giggle, then a tentative story of her own about a dream she'd had. By the end of the first week, the classroom was no longer silent. It was filled with the quiet, expressive language they shared. Daisy's true personality began to emerge. She was fiercely intelligent, with a wicked sense of humor and a deep well of affection that had been stoppered for too long. For Vivian, these hours were an oasis. In this room, with this child, she wasn't a liar or a fugitive. She was just Vivian, a teacher, a friend. Nico Capatos remained a phantom. Vivian would feel his presence, a shift in the atmosphere that signaled he was home, but she rarely saw him. He was a creature of the night, leaving before she and Daisy awoke, returning long after Daisy was in bed. He was a ghost in his own home, and his absence was as powerful as his presence had been at the gala. Yet he was always watching. She knew it. She would see a security camera swiveling to follow her as she and Daisy walked in the meticulously manicured gardens, or catch the eye of a guard who was reporting their progress into a hidden microphone. The reports must have been good, because one evening, as Vivian was reading a bedtime story to Daisy in sign, the bedroom door opened silently. Nico stood there, his suit jacket gone, his tie loosened. He didn't say a word, simply leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable as he watched them. Daisy, seeing her father, signed a quick, excited "Papa." Vivian was telling me about a dragon. Nico's gaze flickered to Vivian, a question in his eyes. She wanted a story, Vivian said softly, her voice feeling loud in the quiet room. A brave knight and a misunderstood dragon. He just nodded, his eyes lingering on Vivian for a beat too long before focusing on his daughter. He walked over to the bed, his movements retaining their predatory grace even in this simple paternal act. He kissed Daisy's forehead, a rare moment of unguarded tenderness that made Vivian's breath catch. As he straightened up, he looked at Vivian. "Join me for dinner." It was not a request. The first dinner was an exercise in tension. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 20, the cavernous room amplifying the clink of silverware. Nico asked about Daisy's progress, his questions precise and detached, as if he were reviewing a quarterly report. Vivian answered just as formally, outlining the educational goals she had set, inventing methodology on the spot, praying her background in liberal arts and her experience with her cousin would be enough to sound convincing. But then, a week later, he joined them for dinner again. This time, he sat closer. He watched Vivian sign to Daisy as she chattered about her day, and for the first time he asked a question not directed at a specialist. He asked, "What are you telling her?" Vivian, surprised, translated Daisy's enthusiastic story about a squirrel she had named Captain Flufferpants. A corner of Nico's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen from him. It was a subtle shift, but it was a beginning. The dinners became a regular occurrence. The vast, empty space between them at the table shrank until he was sitting beside her, the better to see her hands as she translated for his daughter. He began to talk, not just about Daisy, but about his day, speaking of shipping routes and corporate acquisitions in vague terms. Vivian, in turn, found herself talking about books she had read, about her love for old movies, small pieces of her true self slipping through the cracks of her fabricated identity. The moment that everything changed came on a rainy Tuesday. One of the younger housekeepers, a girl named Maria, grew frustrated when Daisy didn't respond to her spoken questions. Vivian entered the playroom to find Maria making a cruel, mocking gesture, flapping her hands near her ears and rolling her eyes. Daisy had seen it. Her face was crumpling, the light in her eyes extinguishing as the old walls of isolation slammed back into place. A cold, protective fury, the likes of which Vivian had not felt since she had finally fought back against Mark, surged through her. She was about to intervene when a low, deadly voice cut through the air from the doorway. "Get out!" Nico stood there, his face a thundercloud. He had come home early. Maria turned, her face pale with terror. "Mr. Capatos, I did—" "You will pack your things," Nico continued, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a venom that made Vivian's skin crawl. "You will be escorted from my property, and if you ever so much as speak my daughter's name again, I will reach down your throat and pull out your tongue. Do you understand me?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face as she scrambled from the room. Nico's rage did not dissipate. It filled the space, a palpable, dangerous force. But it wasn't directed at her or Daisy. It was a shield, a wall of violence meant to protect them. He strode over to Daisy, kneeling before her, his large, powerful hands surprisingly gentle as he wiped away her silent tears. He looked at Vivian over his daughter's head, his gray eyes blazing. "No one," he said, the words a vow, "will ever make her feel small again. Not in my house, not while I live." Vivian looked at this man, this killer, this gangster in a bespoke suit, and she did not feel fear. She felt a confusing, terrifying, and overwhelming sense of safety. He was a monster, but he was their monster. The temptation to lean into that protection, to hide in the shadow of this dangerous man, was a siren song she was beginning to find impossible to resist. The fragile peace Vivian had found within the stone walls of the Capatos estate was shattered by a single photograph. It was a candid shot, a long-lens paparazzi intrusion into a rare public outing. Nico had taken Daisy to a quiet wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he had insisted Vivian accompany them. The photograph captured the three of them standing before a massive Pollock painting. Nico stood slightly behind Daisy, his hand on her shoulder, a look of quiet contemplation on his face. Vivian was kneeling beside Daisy, her hands mid-sentence as she described the chaotic beauty of the art. The image was almost domestic, a portrait of a strange, silent little family. To the world, it was a rare glimpse of the reclusive billionaire. To Detective Mark Jensen, scrolling through celebrity websites on a slow night in his precinct, it was a beacon. He had been searching for her for months, using police databases, tracking her digital footprint, coming up with nothing. He knew her as Sarah, the name she had used before Vivian, but he knew her face. He zoomed in, his heart pounding with a possessive, righteous fury. There she was. Her hair was different, styled more elegantly, and her clothes were expensive, but it was her. And she was with him. Nico Capatos, a man so far above the law that he was practically untouchable. Mark's lips curled into a snarl. She thought she could hide from him there. She had run from a cop into the arms of a kingpin. The irony was bitter, but the challenge was intoxicating. He wouldn't just get her back. He would tear down the king's castle to do it. Mark was not a fool. He knew a direct assault was impossible, so he started small. He began by running surveillance on the estate from a distance, learning the patterns of the guards, the deliveries, the rhythm of the household. He saw her in the garden with the child, saw her getting into armored cars. The rage and jealousy festered inside him, twisting into a singular obsession. He made his first move on a Thursday. Using a stolen uniform and a clone delivery van, he attempted to get past the front gate, claiming to have a fragile art delivery that required a personal signature from a Dr. Thorne. The head of security, a mountain of a man named Dimitri, was polite but firm. All deliveries were processed at the service entrance. No exceptions. When Mark pushed, insisting on his instructions, Dimitri's politeness vanished. He and another guard flanked the van, their hands resting inside their jackets, their eyes as dead and cold as a winter sky. Mark, recognizing a losing battle, retreated, but not before Dimitri's eyes had memorized his face, his false identification, and his license plate. The incident was a minor ripple in the estate's daily operations, but every ripple was reported to Nico. That evening, Nico did not join them for dinner. Vivian felt his absence as a palpable void. After she had put Daisy to bed, she found him in his study, a cavernous room lined with books he had likely never read. He was standing by the window, staring out into the darkness, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "A delivery driver was insistent on seeing you today," he said without turning around. "He used the name Thorne." Vivian froze, the blood draining from her face. It was happening. The past she had run from had found her. "He asked for Dr. Thorne," Nico continued, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned then, and his eyes pinned her in place. The cold, controlled mask was back, but underneath it, something far more volatile was simmering. "A name I am beginning to believe does not exist. You will tell me who he is. You will tell me who you are. And you will not lie to me again." The finality in his tone left no room for evasion. The flimsy structure of her new life collapsed in an instant. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful, but she blinked them back. She would not let him see her as weak. "My name is Vivian," she began, her voice trembling but clear. "Just Vivian, the name I was born with. There is no Dr. Thorne." She told him everything, the words spilling out in a torrent of fear and repressed memory. She told him about Mark, about the charm that had curdled into control, the control into possession, the possession into violence. She told him about the police force that protected its own, about the restraining orders that were useless pieces of paper, about changing her name and running from city to city, always looking over her shoulder. She confessed her lie, explaining the panic she felt when he had confronted her at the gala, the desperate instinct to be anyone but the woman Mark was hunting. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. She braced herself for the explosion, for the cold dismissal, for the order to pack her bags and face the monster she had run from. Nico stood there, his face an unreadable sculpture of granite. He took a slow drink of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. The anger she expected was not there. In its place was a stillness that was far more terrifying, a cold, predatory focus. "He put his hands on you," he said, the words flat, devoid of emotion, a statement of fact that carried the weight of a death sentence. Vivian could only nod, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. Nico walked to his desk, setting the glass down with a precise click. He picked up the phone and spoke a few quiet words in Greek. Then he hung up and turned back to her. He crossed the room and stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not touch her. "He will never touch you again," he promised, his voice a low, guttural vow. For the first time, the mask of the impassive CEO and the cold-blooded Don cracked, and she saw the man beneath. She saw a pain that mirrored her own, a wound that had never healed. "My wife, Alina," he said, his voice rough with an old, ragged grief. "She was sick. The doctors, the best in the world, they told me she would be fine. A rare blood disorder, but manageable. They lied, or they were incompetent." "It doesn't matter." His gaze became distant, lost in a memory Vivian could only guess at. "I had an army of men who could topple governments, but I could not protect her from what was inside her own body. I held her hand as she died, and I swore I would never be that helpless again, that I would never fail to protect the people I love." His eyes refocused on her, and she understood. His obsession with Daisy's safety, his swift and brutal reaction to the housekeeper, his vow to her now, it all stemmed from that single, defining failure. He saw Mark not just as a threat to her, but as a contagion from a world he despised, a world where men in uniform could be more savage than any gangster. He saw a chance to finally win the war he had lost with his wife. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a tear from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark of warmth in the cold, dangerous night. "You are safe here, Vivian," he said. "I will burn his world to the ground." And in his eyes, she saw not the monster she should have feared, but a protector, a fellow wounded soul, and she knew, with terrifying certainty, that she believed him. The neutralization of Mark Jensen was not a loud or bloody affair. It was silent, insidious, and absolute. Vivian was aware of it only as a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house, a quiet thrum of purpose in the men who guarded its perimeter. Nico never spoke of it directly, but his promise echoed in the space between them, a binding contract. Within a week, news reports began to surface, small at first, then growing into a departmental scandal. An anonymous tip had led internal affairs to a treasure trove of evidence detailing years of corruption, evidence tampering, and extortion, all tracing back to one detective, Mark Jensen. His partners turned on him, his superiors disavowed him, and the system he had used as his personal weapon devoured him whole. He was arrested, disgraced, and buried under a mountain of federal charges that would ensure he would never see the outside of a prison cell again. Nico had not used bullets or bombs. He had used information, the most precise and devastating weapon in his arsenal. He had kept his promise. He had burned Mark's world to the ground, and Vivian, for the first time in years, could finally breathe. With the shadow of her past exorcised, the final wall between Vivian and Nico crumbled. The shared confession in his study had been a fulcrum, tilting their relationship from one of employer and employee to something raw and elemental. The tension that had simmered between them for weeks, in the stolen glances across the dinner table, the charged silence of the elevator, the way his presence filled a room, became an unbearable pressure. It broke one night after Daisy was asleep. He found her in the library, curled in an armchair with a book she wasn't reading. He didn't speak, simply came to her and held out his hand. She took it without hesitation, her fingers lacing through his. He led her from the room, up the grand staircase, and into his private wing of the house, a place she had never been. His bedroom was stark and masculine, dominated by a massive bed and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the glittering, indifferent city. He turned to her, and the raw hunger in his eyes stole the air from her lungs. This was not the cold boss or the grieving father. This was the man, stripped of all his titles, his need a palpable force. When he kissed her, it was not gentle. It was a collision, a release of weeks of coiled restraint. It was possessive and desperate, a claiming. And she met him with equal force, her own loneliness and fear and burgeoning desire erupting to the surface. Their intimacy was a tempest, a conversation more honest than any they had ever had with words. In his arms, she was not a victim or a liar. She was a woman, desired, and in a way that defied all logic, cherished. In the quiet aftermath, lying entangled in the sheets, the reality of her situation began to settle in. She had fallen in love with Nico Capatos. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. She was in love with a man who dealt in death and fear, a man whose hands were stained with sins she could only imagine. But they were also the hands that had been so gentle with his daughter, the hands that had brushed away her tears, the hands that had just held her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. Their affair, as it unfolded in the secret, stolen hours of the night, became the new center of her universe. He was a demanding and attentive lover, his possessiveness extending beyond the bedroom. He had her entire wardrobe replaced, filling her closets with designer clothes, telling her he wanted her to wear only things he had given her. He showered her with jewelry, gifts she felt unworthy of, but he would simply clasp a diamond necklace around her throat and murmur, "I want the world to know you belong to me." The price of this protection and passion was her freedom. She was no longer Vivian Thorne, the anonymous woman on the run. She was now an extension of Nico Capatos. She could not leave the estate without a full security detail. Her every move was monitored, not with suspicion, but with an unnerving, suffocating care. She was a beautiful bird in a gilded cage, and the man who held the key was both her captor and her sanctuary. The danger of his world, once an abstract concept, soon became horrifyingly real. The whispers among the staff grew more urgent, the guards more vigilant. The name that was repeated in hushed, anxious tones was Petrov. The Petrov family, a rival Russian syndicate, had long been a thorn in Nico's side. They were cruder, more violent, and they saw Nico's growing legitimacy and his preoccupation with his new domestic life as a weakness to be exploited. Vivian and Daisy were no longer just family, they were targets. The first attempt was subtle. A new gardener was hired, a man whose references had been impeccably forged. He was quiet and efficient, but Dmitri, Nico's head of security, felt something was off. He had the man followed. The gardener was discovered meeting with known Petrov associates. He was dealt with silently. Nico's face when he told Vivian about it was a mask of cold fury, his eyes reflecting the chilling reality that the threat had breached his walls. The second attempt was more brazen. As Vivian and a security escort were driving Daisy home from an audiology appointment, a black sedan slammed into their armored car, trying to force them off the road. The chase was short and brutal, Nico's driver a master of defensive and offensive maneuvers. They made it back to the estate, shaken but unharmed, the sedan disappearing into the city traffic. That night Vivian confronted him. She found him in his study, a map of the city spread across his desk, his men speaking in low, urgent Greek on a conference call. When he was finished, he looked up at her, his face haggard. "This has to stop, Nico," she said, her voice shaking. "I love you. God help me, I do. But I cannot bring Daisy up in this world. I can't live every day wondering if a car bomb or a stray bullet will be the end of us." She saw the agony in his eyes. It was the same fear he had spoken of the night she confessed her past, the fear of being helpless, of his world poisoning the ones he loved. He came to her, pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I know," he whispered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "When Alina died, I thought my heart had turned to stone. I built this empire on fear and control because it was all I had left. But you and Daisy. You have given me something to build for, not just to protect." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I will make you a promise, Vivian. I will build a wall of legitimacy around us so high that no one from my world can ever touch you again. I will cut out the rot. I will end the Petrovs, not just for now, but forever. I will give you a safe life. I swear it on my daughter's soul." It was the most sacred vow he could make, and as Vivian looked into the eyes of the killer she loved, she chose to believe him, knowing that the price of that promise might be a final, terrible war. The war began not with a bang, but with a calculated surgical precision that was Nico's trademark. He started liquidating the more illicit aspects of his portfolio, selling off businesses that were too exposed, too tied to the old ways. He funneled the money into Capato's holdings, bolstering the legitimate shipping and real estate arms of his empire until they were an impenetrable fortress of wealth and public influence. He was transforming from a mob boss who owned a corporation into a chief executive officer who controlled the underworld, a subtle but critical distinction. This shift did not go unnoticed. The Petrovs, led by their brutish patriarch Mikhail, saw Nico's actions not as a move toward legitimacy, but as a retreat. They believed he was going soft, weakened by the woman and the child who now occupied the center of his life. Emboldened, they decided to launch a final, decisive strike, not to gain territory or settle a score, but to decapitate the Capato's organization entirely by killing its head. They planned an assault on the one place Nico considered untouchable, his home. The attack came on a Saturday evening, under the cover of a ferocious thunderstorm that lashed against the stone walls of the estate. The power flickered and died, plunging the house into a disorienting darkness, illuminated only by intermittent flashes of lightning. The backup generators kicked in within seconds, but it was the opening they needed. The assault was twofold: a brute force attack on the main gate to draw the bulk of the security, and a smaller, stealthier team scaling the cliffs from the riverfront, aiming to infiltrate the house itself. In the ensuing chaos, Vivian's fear was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. But it was not for herself. Her every thought was of Daisy. Alarms blared through the house, the sound of distant, muffled gunfire echoing from the grounds. One of Nico's personal guards, a grim-faced man named Stefan, burst into the upstairs living area where she and Daisy had been playing. "They're in the house," he said, his voice tight with urgency as he pushed a panic button on the wall, sealing the residential wing with reinforced steel doors. "Stay here. The boss is handling it." But Vivian knew that handling it meant violence and death, a reckoning unfolding under their own roof. Daisy, feeling the vibrations of the alarms and seeing the panic in the adult's eyes, began to cry, her silent tears more heartbreaking than any sound. Vivian pulled her close, her mind racing. The steel doors were a temporary solution. If the main security fell, they would be trapped. She remembered the old service passages Nico had shown her once, a relic from the original construction of the mansion. She scooped Daisy into her arms. "Stefan, we need to move to the main cellar. It's the most fortified point in the house." He hesitated, his orders being to stay put, but the look of fierce determination in her eyes swayed him. He nodded, his gun drawn, and led the way. In that moment, cowering was not an option. She was no longer a victim hiding from a violent man. She was a woman protecting her family from a violent world, and she would do whatever it took. Downstairs, Nico moved with the lethal calm of a seasoned general. When the alarms had sounded, he had felt not fear but a clarifying rage. They had dared to bring their filth into his home, to threaten his daughter, to threaten Vivian. They had signed their own death warrants. He was not fighting for territory anymore, he was fighting for his future. He directed his men with quiet, precise commands, coordinating their defense, turning his home into a death trap. But he knew this was only half the battle. The true victory would not be in surviving the night. It would be in ending the threat forever. While his soldiers repelled the assault, his other army, the lawyers, the accountants, the hackers, was already at work. As the Petrovs' men were bleeding out on his lawn, their financial empire was being bled dry. Bank accounts were frozen, shipments were seized by fabricated anonymous tips to customs officials, and damning evidence of their operations was being delivered to every major international law enforcement agency. Nico had lured them into a conventional battle, all while he was waging a far more devastating war on a front they hadn't even known existed. The final confrontation happened in the grand foyer. Mikhail Petrov himself, a bear of a man, had breached the main house with his two sons, believing they had Nico cornered. They found him standing alone at the bottom of the grand staircase, waiting for them. "You are a fool, Kapatos," Mikhail spat. "Your woman has made you weak." Nico's face was devoid of expression. "You are mistaken," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "She has given me something to be strong for." The ensuing fight was brutal and short. Nico was outnumbered, but he was faster, more ruthless, and fighting on his own sacred ground. When it was over, Mikhail and his sons lay dead, and Nico stood among them untouched. When the house was finally silent, save for the rain and the distant wail of sirens, Nico found Vivian, Daisy, and Stefan in the cellar. Vivian was holding a sleeping Daisy, her face pale but her eyes clear and steady. She looked at him, at the blood on his knuckles and the grim finality in his expression, and she did not flinch. In the face of the violence she had so feared, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She had chosen this life, chosen this man, and she would not be broken by it. Her trust in him, her acceptance of all that he was, settled something in his soul. The war was over. In the months that followed, Nico fulfilled his promise. The Kapatos' name was scrubbed from any association with organized crime, his transformation into a reclusive but powerful, legitimate businessman complete. The Petrov syndicate, decapitated and financially ruined, collapsed into infighting and was absorbed by its rivals. The shadows of his old life would always linger, but he had built the wall he had promised, a fortress of wealth and power to protect his family. Their future was not a fairy tale. It was a reality forged in violence and bought with blood, but it was theirs. One sunny afternoon, months later, Vivian stood in the sprawling gardens of the estate, watching Daisy chase butterflies. The child was laughing, her hands a flurry of motion as she signed about the colors of their wings. Nico came up behind Vivian, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was no longer a man at war. The tension had left his shoulders, the coldness in his eyes replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that was reserved only for her and their daughter. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze following hers to Daisy. "Our family," he signed, his large hands moving with a now-practiced grace in front of her. Vivian smiled, turning in his arms to face him. She brought her hands up, her fingers gently tracing the hard lines of his face. "I love you," she signed. He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips for a kiss, his eyes conveying the depth of his devotion. "I love you," he signed back. From across the lawn, Daisy saw them and her face lit up. She ran to them, her small arms wrapping around their legs. She looked up at them, her bright eyes full of love, and with a smile that was pure sunshine, she signed it back to them both. Here, in the quiet of their garden, surrounded by the high walls he had built, they were not a boss and his ward, not a captor and his prize, but a family, whole, safe, and finally at peace.